Welcome once again to Solid Rock, where we test the Gospels. My name is Mate de Brossi, and I'll be speaking to my friend and neighbor Peter Murfitt. Peter is the author of the forthcoming book with the same title, Solid Rock. Peter, what I like about what we're doing is we're getting into the discussion about how early Christians really lived.
Yeah.
Today we're going to start by thinking about how books were distributed in the first century. And then we shall look at manuscripts we have about the New Testaments and the Gospels. Last time when we spoke, we saw how the apostles rapidly got into the business of writing. How does this fit in with what we know of secular books at the time? Were there bookshops, libraries? And what about publications of books?
Well, we're fortunate in that Pliny the Younger sheds light on this. Obviously, printing presses did not exist in the Greek and Roman world. At the time, books took the forms of scrolls. Here, this is my scroll, which were made of parchment, that's treated animal skin, or papyrus, like paper. And it was written by hand in continuous columns with text on the inside, and then it was rolled up. So that was a scroll. And then the codex, on the other hand, was made from a stack of parchment or papyrus sheets. Then you folded the stack and you sewed it along the spine here. And that meant that you could have writing on all four sides of the page, if you like. In fact, that's really like a modern book, the codex. So although booksellers existed, the circulation of literature mainly occurred through acquaintances and making personal copies of these borrowed books. Pliny explains how he corrected his text until he was ready to read the final piece. At this point of relinquishing control of the piece, Pliny signalled that the work was ready to be circulated and copied.
But by releasing the control, couldn't the text of the book just kind of change and evolve?
No, Marshall explains that once the work had been circulated in a community, the writing could not be significantly transformed without it becoming widely known. And we come back to the question that we had last time, of these rapid communications, these excellent communications in the Roman world.
So Pliny the Younger, he published a book of letters. So do you think Paul might have done the same thing?
You're quite right. Pliny the Younger kept copies of his letters in view of publishing them later. The Apostle Paul could well have kept copies of his epistles and circulated them as a collection.
Okay, so if I understand what you're saying, the gospel was spread through preaching to begin with, but then the early Christians began to write books, and then they could have been released for publication only once the text had been finalized. And so then they could have circulated without any change being made to the text. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So did the early Christians show any interest in books?
Well, they clearly preferred the codexes to the scrolls because it meant they could put several works together in one volume. They could put the four Gospels together in one volume, or they could put Paul's letters together in one volume. It's clear that the four Gospels were brought together in one volume soon after the writing of John's Gospel in 96 to 98. And Paul's letters could even been produced as a collection even earlier than that.
Okay, so we're going to, I think, move into the discussion about manuscripts. So is there anything you want to say before we start talking about manuscripts?
Yeah, there are three basic ideas that we have to bear in mind when we consider the question of the New Testament manuscripts. And the first one is the most important. It's generally accepted that the closer the date of writing is to the events that the document describes, the more reliable the document. This concerns the veracity of the contents of the document. If, for example, the document concerns eyewitness testimony, then a short time difference between the events and the writing will mean the witnesses will not have suffered memory loss, that a large number of witnesses will still be alive, and that will have not been sufficient time for more sort of legendary aspects to develop and be included in the document.
So how does the New Testament documents fit this criterion?
Well, in future interviews, we shall show that Jesus was born in 7 BC. He pursued his public ministry between 28 and 30. And it turns out that a major proportion of the New Testament documents was written before the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul in AD 65. As we saw last time, the earliest document is doubtless Paul's epistle to the Galatians, penned in AD 49, closely followed by 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Then in AD 55 we have 1 Corinthians and possibly the Semitic version of Matthew's Gospel. The latest major documents of the New Testament are Revelation, John's Gospel and John's epistles were written between AD 95 and 98. However, even these were written by the Apostle John, one of the last living eyewitnesses of Jesus' public ministry, who had been a young lad in AD 28 to 30. So a huge proportion of the New Testament, that's the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, Paul's epistles, Hebrews, 1 and 2 Peter, James, was already written before AD 64-65, and the totality was finished by AD 100. So the totality of the New Testament was completed within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of the events. And that's a huge gauge of reliability of the New Testament documents.
So you mentioned 3 basic ideas concerning manuscripts. So far this is one. What about the other ones?
Well, the other 2 we have to be a bit more careful about. They are the closer the date of the first good copies being to the date of writing, the more reliable the document, because textual variations in the document would tend to accumulate over time. You have to be a bit careful with that one. And then the third one, which we can be a bit more sure about, is that the more copies we have in our possession, the more certain we can be, or the closer we can get to the original text. There's a certain amount of, as I've said, that there's a certain amount of truth in these things, but it's gradually leading us into what we call the science of textual criticism.
Okay, I think we're going to have to go a little bit further into what the science of textual criticism is.
Yeah, well, the easiest way of understanding it is it's the science which tries to establish the original version of an ancient text. And that means there are various questions we have to ask ourselves. How many manuscripts exist of the New Testament? How do we catalogue them? What determines the value of a New Testament manuscript? How do we determine the age of a New Testament manuscript? When can a later manuscript be better? Were the copyists well trained? How many textual variants are there in the various manuscripts, and are they significant? And finally, was there any deliberate textual corruption in the manuscripts, and if so, can it be detected?
So how many manuscripts do we know of that exist of the New Testament?
Well, for the rest of the discussion today, we have to zero in on the Greek text, the Greek manuscripts, and we forget about the other ancient languages of which we've got manuscripts, because they're of limited help in establishing what the original text was. Now, the Greek New Testament manuscripts are all catalogued and registered by the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, that's the INTF, in Germany. And the best estimate, there are between 5,100 and 5,300 Greek New Testament manuscripts. New ones are being discovered all the time, but unfortunately others are being lost through fire, flooding, insects, because they eat manuscripts, and so on. So giving you a definite number is very difficult, but that's maybe not all that useful anyway.
Well, what about compared to other manuscripts?
Well, when we compare the New Testament with other ancient works, we find the New Testament is in really rarefied company compared with the other wider field of classical authors. As a general rule, there are more New Testament manuscripts, many are earlier, they tend to be more complete, but we should probably come back to this later on.
Can you just explain a little bit how to determine the age of a manuscript? I mean, how do we know?
Well, some manuscripts you can determine their age precisely by notes on the copy or by when and where they were found. But unfortunately, radiocarbon dating cannot be used very often because it's destructive. That means that you have to destroy a little bit of the manuscript in order to date it. So in fact, we usually have to rely on the styles of writing, which is called paleography, and that results in a range of 50 years.
So how do we determine the value, how valuable a manuscript is?
Well, let's take two extreme examples. Codex Sinaiticus 01 contains the whole of the New Testament, whereas P12, papyrus number 12, has parts of a single verse from the Epistle to the Hebrews. So they clearly do not have the same value. Many factors need to be taken into account when we consider the value of a manuscript. Its date, its size, its contents, its quality, and whether it comes from a reliable textual stream. More of this later.
So of those just over 5,000 new Greek Testament manuscripts, how many are so-called early?
Well, of those 5,100 to 5,300 Greek New Testament manuscripts, 17% date from the first millennium. The Gospels are best represented in the very early manuscripts. So we've got 6 from the 2nd century, and we've got another 30 from the 3rd century. Then in 350 AD, we weigh in with the big guns with the codexes of the whole of the New Testament. That's Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, etc. But let's not get carried away, because some of the later manuscripts are extremely valuable and useful.
But how can later manuscripts be can be better? How can they be more valuable?
Well, logically, a later manuscript can be better if, for example, it's shown to come from a stable textual stream, or if it can be shown that it in fact contains an earlier reading of the text, or that the scribe who did it was an expert in textual criticism. See, once Constantine came to power in 306, he set up scriptoria in various places where manuscripts were copied by really highly competent and highly trained people. They were capable of using earlier readings to correct their copies.
So what about the scribes prior to Constantine?
Yep. Well, there, fortunately, the situation is good as well, because from what we can tell, they've appeared to have been professional, careful, scrupulous, and well-trained like their Jewish counterparts. Far from being the work of amateurs, the early Christian copyists seem to have been trained in both literary and in documentary, that's sort of financial and legal domains.
So in other words, the New Testament has been faithfully transcribed through history without any major changes?
Absolutely. And this leads most scholars to conclude that we have a very good idea of what the apostles originally wrote. The structure of the New Testament is remarkably stable, especially in comparison with other ancient works.
There's no variance in New Testament texts?
Nobody tries to hide the fact that there are some significant variants in the New Testament. However, there are a large number of variants simply because we've got a large number of manuscripts. And as we saw earlier, if you've got a large number of manuscripts, you'd be quite sure of the original text. So, most people are aware of the variants in John 7:53 to 8:11. That's the story of the woman caught in adultery. Mark 16:9 to 20, that's the end of Mark's Gospel. And John chapter 5 verse 4, which is omitted in some modern translations. In most modern translations, the variants are indicated in the margins or in the footnotes. In the case of the ending of Mark's Gospel, Tom Wright suggests that Mark's original ending is missing and that later copyists were determined to fill in the gap. In the case of John chapter 4, it seems simply that some later scribe wanted to add a detail that he thought that John had omitted.
But I think you just said yourself that with all these manuscripts, there are many variants.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're all significant. Lots of them are minor spelling mistakes of no significance. And none of them affect Christian doctrine because we can establish that from the other readings in the other passages. Peter Williams from Cambridge illustrates this question by considering the first 14 verses of John's Gospel. And we have five completely different editions, having exactly the same number of words and even number of letters. Erasmus's edition of 1516 was made on the basis of two 12th century manuscripts. Then the 1979, 1993 and 2012 editions of the German Bible Society, which is used by most scholars. The 2005 edition by Maurice Robinson, who refers to Byzantine manuscripts. The 2010 edition by Michael Holmes, made under the auspices of the Society of Biblical Literature, that's in America. And the 2017 edition made at Tyndale House, Cambridge. Now all those 5 editions use completely different editorial philosophies when they look at the vast range of manuscripts of John's Gospel, including the 2 earliest papyruses, which are P76 and P75, which are regularly dated to the 3rd century. But when these opening verses of John's Gospel, that's a sequence of 188 words or 812 letters, are examined, there are no differences found between these editions. Erasmus was, in 1516, on the basis of his 2 12th century manuscripts, able to do just as well as 21st century scholars who have all the discovered manuscripts at their disposal. So it's absolutely rational to suppose that the text of the Gospels has been passed down through the centuries with integrity.
All right, so apart from these variants that you explained, could there have been any deliberate scribal corruption of the New Testament text? And if yes, are there ways to detect them?
There is some evidence of scribes introducing deliberate corruptions into the New Testament text, but it can be easily detected by comparing it with the majority reading of the text. There seem to be 2 cases which are fairly certain where there has been corruption. One is in the Western D text of Acts, which was in the Codex Bezae, where there is probably an anti-Jewish bias. The other concerns P72, which contains Jude and 1 and 2 Peter, where the divinity of Jesus is overstressed, so that, for example, God replaces Jesus in 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1. So none of this actually concerns the Gospels at all.
All right, so what's our conclusion to all this?
Well, as Tom Wright puts it, yes, scribes may have introduced alterations here and there, but the massive evidence available means that we are on extremely secure grounds for getting at what the biblical authors actually wrote. And as we've already pointed out, the Gospels were based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. They wrote about what they had seen with their own eyes.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for today. What should we look forward to in the next session?
Well, we'll have to come back to some things that we've gone over a bit rapidly this time, such as the manuscript evidence for other classical works from antiquity and the New Testament manuscripts in other ancient languages. Then we must look at how we receive the New Testament as we know it and how the modern translations are made.
Okay, thank you again, Peter. I think that we can all be reassured that the New Testament has come down to us in essentially what the apostles originally wrote, what they intended to tell us. And of course, concerning the Gospels, it was all based on eyewitness testimony, as you've explained. So we look forward to seeing you all again in about 1 month's time.
Yeah.